In this lesson, we discuss light cache and we'll see how it works. The first thing you need to know about light cache is that it's not quite good at picking out details, and unlike Iridian's map and brute force that are more suitable as the primary GI engines, light cache is quite the opposite and it's more suitable to be used as the secondary GI engines. So in most cases, you use Iridian's map or brute force as your primary engine, and light cache is almost always the preferred choice as the secondary engine. Now let's quickly see how it works. We are in the same simple scene that we use for explaining brute force and Iridian's map. So let me open up my frame buffer and see how light cache works in theory, which is a bit different compared to the overall way that Iridian's map and brute force works. Also, in the render settings windows and in the GI tab, let's enable GI and set light cache as our primary GI engine. And that is for pure explanation, and you would rarely, for some very specific reasons, might use light cache as your primary engine. And as I mentioned, its favorite position is secondary engine. Let's set the secondary engine to none for now. Open up the light cache rollout and make sure the interface is set to expert so we can see all the parameters. Our camera is here in the scene. As light cache is a view dependent method, first tons of rays are sent out from the camera into the scene. The number of these rays is the square of light cache subdivs parameter. Now, in this case, the subdivs is 1,000, so the overall ray count will be about 1,000,000 for this scene. So whenever these rays hit a point on the surface, they create a light cache sample, and each ray will continue to bounce in the scene, and whenever they hit, they create a light cache sample. Each of these rays that come and bounce in the scene store all of that information in their path, and as we learned earlier in this section, these rays carry information between surfaces, and this is how light cache can give us our global illumination solution. Now, to speed up the calculation, imagine a ray comes and creates a light cache sample in a specific point. Now, if another ray comes and hits that exact same point, that ray will be killed off and the information from the existing sample will be used. The number of the bounces will be conveniently controlled by a parameter called bounces. Right now it's set to 100, so each ray can bounce up to 100 times, but obviously most rays wouldn't need that much bounce. You can go ahead and check out the previous lessons and see how light cache compares to other GI solutions in the way they work. Now let's start discussing light cache parameters. Let's render the scene and see what we get with the default parameters. As I start the render, we can see a preview of light cache calculation, and depending on your settings, it might be very quick or it might be slow. The first parameter is subdivs, and as I mentioned, this controls the number of rays that are cast from the camera. Obviously, the higher the number, the higher the quality of your samples, and therefore the higher the quality of your renders. Now let's take a look at a few renders with different subdivs number. Remember, our goal here and in light cache is not to have a detailed noise-free solution. That is not what light cache is for. We get all the details we want from our Iridian's map or brute force as our primary engine, and light cache is only for secondary purposes. So as I go through the renders from subdivs of 10 to 4,000, you can see each time we are increasing the overall quality of our light cache, and at the same time increasing our render time. Okay, now let me set the subdivs to 1500. Next, we have sample size, which controls the size of the light cache samples. The smaller this value, the more accurate and detailed the GI will be, but it also will be a bit noisier. Also, you would need more RAM when the samples are smaller. In the frame buffer, you can see how as I increase the sample size from 0.01 to 0.5, each time we get less detailed subdivision and less noise at the same time. Also, you can clearly see the individual samples as their size gets bigger. Now, let's make sure the sample size is set to its default of 0.01. Next, we have scale, which controls the unit for sample size. And down here, if I change the filter type to fixed, also it controls filter size. Now we have screen and world. In screen space, the sample size is a fraction of the final image. So if sample size is set to 0.01, the sample size would be 1% of the final image, and so on. The screen unit is better for still images and animations, especially with object animations. And world unit is better for fly-through animations where only the camera works and the camera moves. Also, in this mode, the samples that are closer to the camera will appear smoother because they will be sampled more often. Generally, screen is the one you use in most cases, but if you are working with fly-through animations and you are using fly-through mode down here from the light cache modes, you can probably use world. Now, as we have been working in the screen space, you have seen the distribution of the samples in this space. Now let me change this scale to world space and show you a few renders with different sample sizes. As I increase the sample size from 0.001 centimeters to 20 centimeters, you can see the difference in sample distribution and sample sizes. Okay. Let's set the scale to screen and sample size to 0.01. Next, we have retrace and retrace threshold. When retracing is enabled, the GI for the corners and more detailed areas will be recomputed or retraced to make the solution more accurate and avoid any flickering artifacts or light leaks. And we have use for glossy rays enabled down here. Having retrace enabled will prevent any light cache artifacts in the glossy or blurred surfaces, which we'll be talking in a moment. And the value or the retrace threshold here is the amount of retracing. Usually 2 is enough for stills and 8 for animations. I have this plane and light group, and it contains a simple plane and a bright virial light behind it. Let me unhide them and turn the light on. Now we can take a look at two renders, one without retracing and the next one with retracing. In the first one, retrace is off, and we can clearly notice the light leak underneath the plane, and the samples from both sides of the plane are blending and causing this light leak. In the next one, retrace is on, and the light leak is basically, as you can see, gone. We can still see some samples from the other sides, but if we use light cache as our secondary engine and use let's say irradiance map as our primary engine, those samples won't be visible in the final solution at all. So let me quickly set the irradiance map as my primary engine and light cache as my secondary engine. In the irradiance map, set the preset to medium and make sure that check sample visibility is on. And in the light cache, make sure retrace is on. And this would be the render with these current settings. And as you can see, we don't have those very bright samples visible in the final render. Let's set our primary engine to light cache and secondary engine to none. Another useful option to avoid any light leak is leak prevention down here, and by default is set to 0.8. This option kind of works hand in hand with the retrace option, and let me show you two renders with light leak prevention set to 0 and 1, and in both of them we have retrace turned on. In the render with the leak prevention set to 0, as we can see, we get the light leak even though we have retrace on, and in the render with prevention set to 1, the light leak is gone. Now let's make sure the leak prevention is set to default of 0.08. Also, let me turn off the second light and hide the plane and the light group. Next, we have show calculation phase. When enabled, you can see a light cache preview while it's being computed before the final image being rendered. We have use camera path, and when enabled, the light cache will be calculated for the entire camera path instead of just the current camera view. In the light cache modes down here, we have a mode called fly through. If we just have camera animation and no object animation, you would use fly through mode. But if you have also object animations, in that case, the mode down here need to be set to single frame. So for each frame, we'll be calculating a new light cache, right? And in that situation, having use camera path on will reduce flickering in general, because the position of light cache samples on static geometries, the geometries without any animation, will be fixed during the animation. I have this animated cubes in the scene. Let me go ahead and unhide them. Also select the first physical camera and make sure it's the active one. As you can see, it has a simple camera animation, and also you can see these animated cubes and their dynamic motion. Now in the render settings, make sure light cache is your primary engine and set the secondary engine to none. Enable use camera path, make sure the mode is single frame. In the comment tab, enable active segment and set the very nth frame to every nth frame to 1. Okay, now let's up here enable save file. Let me go inside the render output folder for this lesson. Let me create a new folder and name it animated cubes or whatever you want. And let's save it out as PNG or whatever you like. Now let's hit the render and see what we're gonna have. As you can see, for each frame, V-Ray considers the entire camera path and calculates the light cache for the entire camera path. And because the mode is set to single frame, the light cache is being built for each and every frame separately. Now, if we didn't have those animated cubes, we could set the mode to fly through and it would have been a lot easier. Now, having use camera path enabled wouldn't entirely remove every single artifacts and flickering. It helps to reduce the overall flickering, but to get flicker-free animations, you need to increase your light cache settings. In this case, we actually didn't do that. We just have use camera path turned on, and we'll see how it affects our final result and animation. Now let me stop the render, and I can show you the final animations. Now, from the rendering menu, click on Compare Media in Ramp Layer. Now let's load the frames and wait a bit. Now, if I go frame by frame, you can see we still have some flickering, but it would have been a lot worse if the render was done without use camera path enabled. Actually, I have another render in which use camera path was off. Let's load that render in channel B. Now let me change the frame rate to 10 and play the animation. As you can see, the flickering is a lot worse in this animation. Take a look at the top of this table, for example, and every corner, and as you can see, we get tons of flickering. But in channel A, which is the render with camera path on, the flickering is a lot less compared to channel B. Okay, now let's close the ramp layer, clear the current image from the frame buffer. In the render settings and comment tab, make sure single is active as your time output. Also disable save file. In the GI tab, let's make sure use camera path is disabled for now. Also, let me hide these cubes. Okay, now let's talk about filters. Like irradiance map in light cache, the samples will be created for some points in the scene. For the points without any light cache samples, we need to interpolate and average the samples that are around it to get the GI solution for that particular point, right? So that's when the filter parameters comes into play. We have three filters: none, nearest, and fixed. When set to none, no filtering or interpolation is done, and the value of the closest sample to the point in question will be used for that point. It is fast, but it can give some artifacts near the detailed areas. Next, we have nearest, and it uses the closest samples to the point in question and averages their value. And the number of these close samples is being controlled by interpolation samples down here. And it's better to use this one if light cache is used as secondary engine, which is most of the time. Finally, we have fixed. In this mode, the value for all the samples that fall into a certain distance from the point in question will be averaged and used as the value for that point. And that distance or size is controlled by filter size down here. It gives you smoother results compared to nearest, and this filter is preferable if you use light cache as your primary engine, which is rare. Now let's take a look at three renders with these three filters and see how they look. In the first render, the filter is set to none. The second one is nearest, and the third one is fixed. Obviously, from none to fixed, we get smoother renders. Also, if you increase the interpolation samples for the nearest method or the filter size for the fixed method, you would have smoother but less detailed renders. Now let me change the filter type to nearest again. Next, we have pre-filter, which is another type of filtering that is happening before the render, unlike the main filter that's happening during the render. And it kind of works on individual samples and makes sure that they are averaged properly, and the higher the number, the blurrier the final result and less detailed it will be. Now let me show you a few renders with different pre-filter values. As I go from 2 to 100, you can notice a slight change. We lose a bit details each time, and the overall result gets blurrier. Now let me set the render that has pre-filter of 2 as my A channel or A side, and pre-filter of 100 as my B. And we clearly have more detail on the left side, which is the A channel, but the result is blurrier and less noisy in the B side with pre-filter set to 100. Okay, let's set the pre-filter back to 20. Next, we have use for glossy rays. If enabled, the light cache algorithm will be used to compute glossy reflections and refractions in our materials. When we discuss materials, we'll be getting back to this option and demonstrate how it affects your material. Also, when you have this option enabled, it's recommended to have retrace also enabled. Otherwise, the light cache samples will be visible in the glossy surfaces. Next, we have store direct light, which is very important when you use light cache as a primary engine, and less important if light cache is your secondary engine. When this option enabled, light cache will be storing and interpolating the direct lighting also. Now in the frame buffer, in the first render, light cache is the primary and only GI engine, and store direct light is on. As you can see, the direct light is very blurry, and if I go to my lighting path here, you can see there is no information here. In the second render, store direct light is off. We get our sharp lighting back, and as you can see in the lighting path, we get the direct lighting the way we expect. So if light cache is your primary engine, you should disable store direct light. And if it is your secondary engine, you can turn it on because we get our sharp lighting from the primary engine in that case, which is Irradiance Map or Brute Force normally. In the next two renders, I had Irradiance Map as my primary engine and light cache as my secondary engine. In the first render, store direct light is on, and in the next one it's off. And it's really hard to see any noticeable difference between the two renders. Let's make sure store direct light is on and light cache is our primary engine. Next, we have bounces, which we discussed at the beginning of this lesson, and that is the number of GI bounces. And as I mentioned, this is a limit here, and light cache probably wouldn't use all these bounce, but the more bounce usually means more accurate and brighter renders. Let's see a few renders with different number for bounces. In the first one, bounces was set to 1. The next one is 2, and it clearly is brighter compared to the previous one. The next one is 3, 4, 5. And as you can see, each time the scene gets a little brighter because we allow the rays to bounce more. The next one is 10, and it's barely brighter compared to 5. The next one is 20, and the final one is 100. And as we increase the bounce number in the smaller numbers like 1 and 2 and 3, we can clearly see a difference. But here I can't see any difference between 10 and 100 bounce, for example, simply because after a certain point those rays wouldn't have enough energy to contribute anything. Also, Viri does not use all that 100 bounce. So that's why the difference is so small in the higher numbers. Let's make sure the bounce is set to 100. Finally, we have light cache modes. Single frame and from file are exactly like their Irradiance Map counterparts. In case of from file, the pre-filter calculation is not saved with the file. So if you load the light cache file, you need to adjust your pre-filter parameter before the final render. Next, we have fly through. If the camera is the only thing with animation in the scene, you need to use this mode. In this mode, the light cache for the entire animation is calculated in the first frame, and that same light cache will be used for the subsequent frames. Next, we have progressive path tracing, and right now it's more for legacy purposes, honestly, as there is a better way to achieve similar results, and that is the progressive image sampler that we're going to talk about it in the next section. The way progressive path tracing works is in this mode, light cache will be used to compute the final image progressively. So we'll have the entire solution just by using light cache. Let me just increase the subdiff to something like 5000 and start the render. You need to increase the subdiff number to get a fairly clean render when using progressive path tracing. What you see is actually the final image being progressively refined using light cache, and if we wait a bit, the image will get cleaner by time. Okay, let me stop the render here. As we used light cache in our complex scene in conjunction with brute force and Irradiance Map in our previous lessons, I'm going to skip that part. Another GI engine that we have is Photon Map, and Light Cache is derived from it and improves Photon Map in every single way. So I wouldn't explain Photon Map here because the Light Cache completely replaces it and improves upon it. Finally, let's sum up the strengths and weaknesses very quickly of Light Cache. First, it's very fast and gives excellent results as secondary engine. But it's not adaptive like Irradiance Map, and Light Cache is computed at a fixed resolution. It has some issues with bump maps. Also, when we have motion blur enabled in our camera, we can get some inaccuracy in our renders. So that's about Light Cache, and I will see you in the next lesson.